This video is designed to teach you everything you need to know about healing your hips. So what we're going to cover today is teaching you everything you haven't yet been taught. Then I'm going to give you practical action steps for overcoming injuries and getting pain-free through the hips. Finally, I want to show you what to work towards in order to become not only pain-free but powerful down here as well. So we'll cover some basic anatomy. I think anatomy is often used as a mask to appear intelligent and confuse people. So I really want to break this down and make it super simple for you. The ones that we need to take note of, or we want to be looking at your psoas major. So you can think of this as, well, that is your hip flexor, right? So most people don't realize what the hip flexor muscle actually is. So that's this one here that I've just covered over. And then we'll move into glute maximus, glute medius, and then deeper below these two, you've got the piriformis. So very commonly irritated and annoyed, and very often needs to be relieved as well. So the hip flexor, the leg, and plays a role, its tightness plays a role in the extension of the hip/leg as well. And the glute muscles are responsible for stabilization of the hip. If you look at this picture, you can see there's a lot of ligaments in the hip. That's why the hip is known as one of the very complicated joints and often has a lot of stuff going wrong with it. Here, what this presentation is going to cover is adding strength and length to the muscles of the hip in order for you to be able to move your hips pain-free and as best you can. So we'll move down into, to make things a little simpler, we'll look at it through the functions. So there's dozens of ligaments, there's only really 3 functions. So we've got flexion extension, we're looking at the iliopsoas and the rectus femoris, moving the leg. You can see it from both angles here. One important distinction is as you see this moving to the top, as the leg becomes fully flexed, there's only so much that the hip flexor can flex. There's only so far it can contract before you're not moving within the hip joint, you're actually moving the whole pelvis itself. So that's why hip pain can sometimes become back pain, is once the hip muscles are as tight as they can be, then the pelvis, and the pelvis being the bottom of the spine, actually starts to shift. So when that occurs, that does naturally occur at times, but if we're doing that excessively, people think they're just moving their hips when they might actually be throwing their back in and out of position. This is extension as well. This is a split squat, which we'll cover off later, but you can see that back leg is in full hip extension. Moving down into abduction and so abduction is taking the leg away from the midline of the body. AD is moving the leg towards the midline of the body. And our final function is external and internal rotation. So those are the 3 functions of the hip, and therefore we have 3 functions that we need to train in order to have fully healthy hips. Let's cover off what we're going to do. We break this down, these 3 functions, into 3 patterns of movement. So hip flexors and extenders, then we've got the lateral movements, then we've got, we're working our hip flexors, then we're working the lateral movers, then we're working the hip extenders, and combining that with the external rotation, because hip extension comes from the glutes, as does external rotation of the hips. In terms of the flexors, firstly here we've got the ATG split squat. You can do this body weight, you can do this with your foot elevated, then you can begin to use dumbbells in your hand as well. So by dropping in and pushing my knee over my toes, I actually open up the back hip flexor. Performing this exercise will probably be the most intense hip flexor stretch you've ever felt. Girls will sometimes be able to get into this position first try. Guys often require to elevate their front foot in order for the hip to actually allow them to open up and get deep enough. Your metric is thinking of squishing, I'll just draw it for you guys, squishing the hamstring down into the calf. So you can see I'm tightly pressed hamstring to calf on this one. Next up, we'll move into the kettlebell hip flexor lift. So what I'm doing here, this first one is about opening up the hip flexor. Our second exercise is strengthening the hip flexor. I have my leg down in a neutral position. You'll have length through the hip flexor, not full length, but some length, and then pull up using your foot, and that's contracting the hip flexor. Oftentimes people's hip flexors aren't quite strong enough, and that can be a real cause of hip flexor pain. The seated pike leg lift is a similar exercise, really working your core and the hip flexors. This is more of a pumping and cramping effect. So with the kettlebell hip flexor lift, it's more of a mid-range movement. You're not fully extended and you're not fully shortened. With the seated pike leg lift, you're very, very short. We're only working the fully contracted position. Oftentimes this might even induce a cramping feeling. Then we'll move into lateral movement. So the Cossack squat. This is the ultimate exercise. I absolutely love this one for knee strength, for hip strength, opening up the hips hugely. So what you want to do, you can do this body weight, you can do this assisted by holding onto a pole in front of you, and then simply you're going to keep one leg straight and out to the side as you drop into what's essentially a half squat on the other leg. So you've got one leg that's down in a deep squat and the other leg is out to the side. So with this movement, we'll really open up the inner thigh. You'll feel this stretch immediately. You will probably feel it down into the knee, potentially all the way down into the ankle. And most people never build this lateral strength through their hips. I think it's one of the biggest reasons for hip instability and hip pain. Finally, we're moving into hip extension and external rotation. So first up, we've got the glute targeted hip extension. And what we're doing here is just beginning to activate and work the glutes. If hip flexion and lifting your legs up, getting tight through the hips is painful, then we unwind it, we reverse it by doing hip extension. Then we'll move into the glute lock clam. So activating the gluteus maximus. The gluteus maximus is responsible for the stabilization of the hip and a lot of the hip extension as well. Stabilization and extension. So this is a very small movement, getting your foot wrapped behind your ankle, arms straight and resting on the ground, pelvis tilted forwards. We don't want to move your hips. We want to move the muscle inside the hip. So we're not shifting your pelvis backwards and forwards, because that would be working your bones in your back. What we actually want to do is just contract the muscle inside the pelvis, which itself is stationary. Then finally, we're going to move into the Patrick step up. This exercise activates the glute. So with the knee that is bent, I want to think of dropping it forwards, not inwards. So we activate the external rotators and the stabilizers by fighting to keep my knee dropping out to the side rather than dropping down and in, which is a symptom of weak glutes. We reverse it with this exercise. So how can you go about doing this? If you have sore hips or you need to develop flexion and lateral strength, this routine is what I would add to your program. 3 days a week, doesn't matter what days you do them. Seated pike leg lifts. Here we're pumping, we're contracting, we're getting the hip flexors nice and tight. That's a warm up. It's good for healing as well. The kettlebell hip lift, we're starting to build strength through that psoas. Then finally, the ATG split squat, we're building length here. You need length and strength through your hips in order to keep them pain-free. Day 2, we've got the supine hip extension, activating the glutes. Glute lock clam, really working the gluteus maximus, activating that. Then moving into the Patrick step up, and you should be primed to keep external rotation here and feel your glute contract and support your hips. Finally, Friday, you've got the Cossack squat. Incredible for opening up the inner thigh, the actors. If you have a history of groin injuries or hip niggles while rotating or kicking, Cossack squat is incredible for you. I'll leave the link for this whole document in the description. I will try to update it and make it better over time. Have a good one, guys.